we sort of start, these are, at least as I understand, sort of the big players in really aggressive cyber behavior. The Chinese have their army of hybrid private and government actors focused on control of information domestically. Externally, they steal it if it's not bolted down. If it is bolted down, they steal it anyway. Most famously, 61398, as pointed out in the Mandate report, and the ongoing use of Wikipedia as a tool of political warfare. It's fascinating because they keep blocking my websites. And they engage in Huawei is, of course, a Chinese telecommunications company, which is known for infiltrating things and allowing things like 61398 sort of swooping behind them and taking advantage of the system. That is, former special recon, a word you will learn later. The North Koreans have their small group of very small hackers. They're based in Shanghai. It's called Unit 121. It's based in their intelligence directorate directly. They are really awful to the South Koreans. Constantly intelligence collection, monetary damage. They crashed their servers and financial servers. They wiped them a couple years ago. So social confusion. There's always rumors going on in the South Korean and newspapers about weird things. South Korea decides to reunite with the North. Has been a headline 3 or 4 times in South Korean papers. This is a form of irregular warfare. The Iranians have a small group of hackers, but it's expanding, as we learned previously. They're internally focused with their population control, but that is sort of growing to look outward as well, especially against the Israelis. Their Shamoon, the Shamoon program we've all heard so much about is a raid or direct action. It is not the word cyber war connotates a duration of time and legal and ongoing definitions. This is a raid. Run in, break things, leave. And they did a good job of it. The Russians have their own private hackers and sort of government hacker hybrid things. They're focused on interesting more sort of the strategic use of cyber. Estonia, Georgia are the 2 examples that come to mind. Those are also direct action raids. Why do all these words matter? And of course, this is what we do. We do roughly the same thing. On the left is U.S. sort of clandestine cyber operations. This is what's in the open press, though. It's not disclosed by Snowden. We look internationally at other powers and do roughly the same thing. Infiltrate, exploit, sort of assess what's going on. We look internally for counterterrorism work, dealing with Al-Qaeda and lone wolf attacks, things like the Boston bomber, Foot Hood, so on and so forth. We intrude, but as far as I know, we don't actually steal things like China does, which is a caveat. On the right is what happens when you take cyber warfare and industrialize it for the U.S. military. This is a DARPA project called Plan X, launched in 2012, and basically is designed to take cyber warfare from the realm of those who are very bright and apply it to those like me who don't know anything about cyber warfare, and they can use it on the battlefield for their personal advantage. Example would be an army front approaches a town, the power's down in the town, we want to turn off the power, orders go up the chain of command, we want to turn the power off, comes down, use this button. They press a button, the power goes out in town, great, army rolls in. Earlier we discussed a bunch of exciting words. This is what special operations do. When we send in the SEALs, they do one of 12 things, basically. And it's these sort of 12 things that they do. And I'm using this as a framework because I believe that cyber warfare is a misnomer. Cyber SOLIC, which is low-intensity conflict, is a much more accurate phrase to describe it because warfare has legal and scale connotations. And there is certainly a conflict going on between the Iranians and the Israelis via cyber, between us and the Chinese on cyber, and it is not a war. No one is shooting. I think there's maybe 1 death associated directly with cyber attacks. That's not a war by any stretch of the imagination. But there is a drastic sort of increased tensions between the two. How does this apply to cyber? The Syrian Electronic Army, that's a form of irregular warfare practiced by Assad against his opposition. If the Saudis had the ability to defend foreign internal defense against Shamoon, which is officially done by the Committee of Sword and Justice or something like that, which is probably an Iranian front, if they had some sort of cyber foreign internal defense, might not have been nearly, if they simply had doubled their servers, wouldn't be bad. For counterterrorism, network exploitation, who talks to whom and how often, and from that you can sort of pull out a chain of command, and from there, online and go from there. Operation Informations, muffins of mass destruction. In 2011, British foreign intelligence got a hold of a jihadi bomb-making website, and on there they had a recipe how to make explosives. The Brits took that out and instead put it how to make muffins, Betty Crocker chocolate chip muffins. And the jihadis for a while were making bomb muffins that wouldn't explode but tasted great and tasted like electronics. fantastic. More of that is great. Special recon, Chinese technology theft. They go in, steal our stuff, and leave. That's a form of reconnaissance. Go in. How do the networks work? What do they look like? How are they connected? And how do they work? Whenever they sort of steal, they can employ against it in some other fashion. Direct action. Stuxnet. This is a raid. Go in, break things, leave. Unofficially, it's unknown who did this. But rumor on the street is that the U.S. designed it, gave it to Mossad on a stick. They passed it around to some people. It ended up in the hands of disgruntled Iranian scientists who plugged it in, and we had Stuxnet. That is a raid, enter and leave, but the virus stayed behind and became public knowledge. We can discuss it here. Counterinsurgency, the buzzword of the last 12 years up in Washington. Jihadists online have taken the internet to recruit and do everything possible, fundraise, recruit, procure things from the Silk Road and so on. And countering that would make any sort of stopping that activity would halt their ability to wage an insurgency in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so I argue that cyber warfare contains elements that directly follow special operations principles. And so we're going to look at the most exciting things, direct action, raiding things. They must be simple, secure, repetitive, surprise, speed, and purpose. Those are the six sort of basic things you need for a successful raid. By the Iranians, it's fairly straightforward. Go in, break Aramco and Razgas. Secure, they told nobody about it. Nobody knew it was coming. That is good. Repetition, it was practice and skill because they got in and broke 32,000 computers. Surprise, the Saudis really didn't know it was coming until the day before. There's someone in our system. Well, we should do something about this perhaps. Speed, it happened quickly. It's all cyber, it happens very quickly. Things can happen quickly, and that limits your time to recover. Purpose, the Iranians were going to break Aramco. They broke Aramco, and to this day, the damage continues and will continue for the next 2,000 or 3,000 years. On the flip side, there's the infamous Abbottabad bin Laden raid, and it follows the same 6 principles. We want to get bin Laden. We're going to practice it a lot. Really good at it. We're going to flip in the dead of night, and they did. And success was had. Another example of this is, in fact, irregular warfare. This is a definition on the left for those of you who do not follow military affairs as closely as I do. On the right, this is what it looks like when you apply it to cybery things. You can have cyber irregular warfare as a way to strip legitimacy from a government. You can set up different banking systems. There are ways to degrade. Because governments operate online, they have email addresses and they have their own sort of cyber espionage things. You can counter that as an insurgent and keep your own networks alive. The terrorists have done this today with email accounts. They talk to each other through all the same email accounts, save it all as a draft. That's a form of cyber electronic warfare to get around NSA's power to soak things up.
So did Petraeus.
But the terrorists can do it properly. Have not made the news.
Use some encryption on top of that.
Do a lot of things. Foreign internal defense. This is us helping somebody else defeat insurgency. On the left is, of course, the boring duty definition for those who don't know what it is. On the right, so this is how you can possibly do it. And Anonymous and LulzSec are examples of this. They are currently not terrorist groups, but they are precursors of things to come. You have groups that sort of mobilize on their own, and they can do their own exciting things. And from there, they are the precursors of things to come. They're currently not really being, malignant and really aggressive in destroying things. But if you had a well-funded group in the future, as we have the network of the Internet of all things, is the whole Internet, as I believe today's buzzphrase, as that sort of increases and becomes more possible and usable, that is a problem unto itself. You could actually have cyber terrorism, people run around on the Internet and maliciously break things for a political end. Shamoon is, I think, a very interesting event because if the Saudis had the ability to sort of stop cyber events, if they had the ability to sort of stop cyber events unfolding, you wouldn't have 32,000 hard drives now as giant paperweights. That would be good.
A question, would this be a good analogy for sort of military interaction with the civilian sector, especially companies that are multinational?
Yes.
The concept of active defense and who's got capability to maybe push back or take out command and control or do something of that nature.
Yes, cyber is not just warfare with cyber is no longer just the domain of governments. Now it is a whole of because you target mostly private things in cyber warfare, I would imagine. And so now it is a whole of basically the nation approach to sort of dealing with this. And warfare has now become a problem of the people. I mean, who was hacked by China? Google, it's a private company. Northrop Grumman, by and large, a private company. All the sort of big contractors, they're all private companies, but they have ties to the government because they are tied. They're therefore targeted by a variety of nations. So because it is more tied together, the public and private sector, then they must come together and sort of come up with a way to do all of this. At least you end up with the private sector saying, meh, or the government sector saying, we don't really care until you have some sort of cataclysmic event, which is suddenly all say, oh, we should have cared 10 years ago.
Darren, I want to follow up on John's point here, because as soon as you bring in the private sector into something like this, if we look at the traditional special forces, often they're operating outside the rules of conventional war, outside the legal frameworks of their country of origin,
yes,
the U.S. If you're talking bringing in the private sector, that's going to even further limit the ability for what he's saying is a special forces group to operate. Is that, how do you manage this, especially under the FISA NSA microscope that we're under these days? I mean, isn't this, well, how do you make this happen?
You don't. It's very difficult to do, but this is more of a conceptual framework by which you can examine cyber warfare. I think that if you examine cyber warfare from a Clausewitzian point of view, you've lost it.
I think you do the Blackwater thing, you hire somebody out of the government, and then you bring them into the private sector.
That is a way to look at it.
I'm not saying, because I'm not privy to it, but there used to be a story that when you wanted someone listened to, you get the Brits to do it, and when we wanted someone listened to, you get the Americans to do it. So when you guys want something done, you ask a British company to do it. You've seen the website of one last night on the demo, and we do the same with a US company. Problem solved.
We don't call the SAS to go do a SEALs operation, I'm sorry.
Well, I've called ex-SEALs to do stuff that I need to do, and Mike Jenkins prime example.
Obviously, you've never watched The Rock.
We're homeland.
But if you consider, if I think at least that if you can consider, continue to examine cyber warfare through the realm of a Clausewitzian world, you have too much of an dichotomy between war and peace, and the line is definitely blurred. And special forces are sort of, at least in the reality, if you will, the sort of third option between a really harshly worded demarche and we're just going to destroy all of your air bases. Instead, we'll use the SEALs, we'll use special forces to do so. And I think if you adapt that framework for examining cyber warfare, it's much more effective and easier to look at. This example is simply cyber defense.
The short question is, what can we learn from the Cold War? Because everything you've talked about here in cyber, I can very easily see an equivalent, something that happened.
Yeah, this is first chief director in Africa in the 1980s. Yes. KGB.
Yeah.
You can definitely learn a lot. Our concept of even our concept of information in IO, we don't have the lexicon to discuss it fully, which is why after 25 years we can't really agree what IO is or is not. The Russians had a dictionary in 1985. It's got to be this thick, if not more. It's put out by the KGB, and it clears out very clearly IO definitions. And there are some 60 terms to discuss IO. And they have an established lexicon, and the lexicon has stayed, even though the KGB's fallen apart. The dictionary is still in existence to this day. And we don't even have the lexicon to discuss information operations and stuff like this. And other nations not only have the lexicon to discuss it, but they do it. So the next example of this would be cyber counterterrorism. How do you use cyber things to take down terrorists? As terrorists turn more to the internet, the days of Red Army faction and the Red Brigades are sort of done. There's no more of these large sort of hierarchical structure groups. They're sort of more spread out. Like Al-Qaeda is the best sort of running example of this as we speak. But they have to communicate with each other from Maghreb to Pakistan and back, and they do it through the internet, email addresses and so on. And sort of how do you use cyber tools to disrupt not only their communications but funding, research, procurement, tactical discussions, and even eavesdropping. There was a conversation held between al-Zawahiri and the head of Al-Qaeda operating out of Yemen. And it made national news here in the States. We intercepted their phone calls, and that's why we shut down a bunch of embassies last September, as I believe is when this was. And 3 weeks later, the line went dead, and it has not been active since. In 1998, the same thing happened. We had a lead in bin Laden's cell phone, and it made the New York Times, I believe, and the line went dead 2 weeks later, and it's been dead ever since.
And if you read the Cuckoo's Egg, John Austin, who was running the New Scotland Yard police unit, they were about to pursue and make arrests when the cyber general at the time said, "We've got the Soviets that are running this campaign," before the investigation could be completed. That's how long ago? Screwed up.
I mean, an earlier version of this is the IRA in northern Belfast. The IRA, the North Ireland police managed to wiretap a bunch of phones in Belfast, and the IRA found out about it and tapped all their taps. And for 7 years, they knew everything that the North Ireland police heard. And it's only through dumb luck that they sort of stumbled on it. They stopped the IRA intelligence chief in a traffic stop for seatbelt violation and pulled out, "Oh, look, your folder on your chair," went through it and threw him in jail. And raided the house 4 months later and found they had tapped every phone tap that they had tapped in Belfast. And it was really quite something. But cyber terrorism, if you set up sort of a fake terrorist group online, you could possibly use to draw them in and sort of collect them in that fashion. Subvert terror networks. There are ways to do this. PSYOPs and IO. And again, this weapons of mass destruction, I think, is a great example of sort of things you can do to twerk and irritate terror groups because they're suddenly building better muffins in their crock pots.
I hope that isn't a joke that's being told a lot, because it implies that your adversaries are stupid, and that's really dangerous, especially for special ops.
No, they're actually very, very intelligent.
Jokes about making muffins instead of bombs, I think, are dangerous.
They did. They honestly.
Actually, I know that story, and we can talk about that offline.
Okay. Anyway, information operations and psychological operations. There are ways to do with cyber things as well, and sort of the ways you can influence the way someone perceives the world and how they can act and interact, and you can curtail and alter how they perceive the reality and act through their information is targeting for manipulation. And if you can alter how someone perceives the world by flooding their inboxes or altering their emails in some fashion, give them bad information, there are ways to do that. And sort of, well, if nothing else today, other countries basically have equivalent units of this who can very, very elite, very good at what they do, break in, break things, they raid, spy, extract information, and leave. If cyber is in fact its own domain, it requires its own military force to do so. And you have to operate here with its own military force, a conventional and unconventional. And this is sort of a loose framework for maybe what an unconventional force would or would not do. But greater integration between special operations and cyber would make all of this much more easier. I see a lot of connections and lines between how one operates and how the other operates, and drawing them together. Because they sort of operate along the same framework and operation and behavior, keeping them separate and keeping them sort of disassociated and unaware of each other does no favors across the board, because other nations sort of operate along these same lines, and keeping them in their own separate houses away from each other does no good. And so perhaps there should be some sort of exchange program between Cyber Command and SOCOM. That's just an idea I had, to sort of encourage a sort of talking between each other. That's 20 minutes. That's 20 minutes. That's it. In fact, 30 seconds early. That's my presentation. And now bring forth the questions.
So if there'd been a virtual Osama bin Laden program successful, what would the hunt for virtual have for these program? So how would you see the hunt for the virtual Osama bin Laden?
They're only, this of course works assuming that they're in fact on a network. Bin Laden hid in a house in Abbottabad burned his own trash, had no internet connection, no phone lines.
Black and white TV.
Maybe. operated by courier, was basically off the grid entirely, knowing that we were looking for any sort of ties to him. We eventually tracked him down. We found his courier. We found the code name for his courier in like 05, and the name was actual courier in 07. And sort of followed his courier around for a couple years, and the courier, really good, was very good at dropping our tails all around Pakistan. And we finally traced it back to this house in Abbottabad, and we said, this house looks weird. So it really depends. This is all based on the premise that terrorists use.
But one of the plans that they had was for a virtual Osama bin Laden. So this guy pops up in any place in cyberspace, plants his poison, and obviously becomes a bit like Max Headroom. So Max Headroom with a turban. How would the hunt for him look? I mean, do you think it could happen?
Yeah, the hunt could happen. I don't know how it would look. You need someone who does forensics to give you a much more descriptive answer of that. And
we've seen that we've seen ideological leaders who jump up and take part, especially in the activism realm. And they've been able to push swarming effects against corporate targets based on their ideological reasons or whatever, and they're not necessarily the ones carrying out the attacks, but they're certainly pushing forth all the, at the very back of a lot of it. Cebu, while he was being run by the FBI, was certainly pushing a certain ethos. He was getting information on one side of the game from people who were literally bringing him access to certain things. He was pushing very low-level DDoS on some end while he was working intrusions on the other end. I mean, he was I don't know if into politics of it, but, he was sort of a virtual Max Headroom, I guess.
Darren, thank you very much. Back in the early days with Dan Keel, and when we started meeting these guys, I was on a training circuit with the Defense Intelligence Agency in cyber war. This was like '94. We started doing it, and I was asked to build a set of exercises that were not sophisticated like we do today, but fairly simple conceptual exercises with some role playing to put people through some of the thought processes. The games were effectively Star Trek II, Kobayashi Maru. They were unwinnable games. I put on about 300 of them. One group fucking won.
Cheats.
Who won? The Navy SEALs. And they cheated. Absolutely cheated, but that was like 95, 96. It taught me so much conceptually about Spec Ops, and that's why I was appreciating your paper and the concept, because I'm not sure we've really been talking about Spec Ops a whole lot with this thing, from surgical strikes and getting things done that it's taken care of. Don't worry about it. Which is a good answer in a lot of cases.
Did they break in overnight?
No, they did it within 90 seconds live.
called it an airstrike.
No planning there.
Yeah, it was. I'll tell you later.
The answer, you die.
It was fundamentally ridiculously simple. I had not considered it as a threat vector. It was a my bad. And I learned, and I said, I got to redo this son of a bitch now. And so I had to redo it and reframe it, and it never got one after that. But they taught me so much about their mindset, because this was not cyber guys.
But that's the nature of our craft, Will. We can't